Hey everyone, starting in just about 3 minutes actually. Just want to do an audio check here. Can you hear me? Hey everyone, we are starting. What am I doing here? Pull up my thing. All right, so this is episode 8 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. This one's about the Buddha and mindfulness. We do these watch parties every Monday at 9 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. GMT, and then we do a discussion 1 hour later over Zoom, which will also be broadcast at the end of this video. So we'll just take like a 10-15 minute intermission. Then we'll open it up. You guys can join if you want to discuss. If you want to just watch and not participate in the actual video discussion, then just hang out in the YouTube channel or this video that you're watching from. You can participate in the chat, but we don't always get to it. It's just kind of too much to do the discussion in video and watch the chat. But you guys can obviously talk amongst yourselves. The discussion Zoom link will be given during the intermission, so we'll see you there. As well, all the information that I just mentioned will be on a kind of ticker at the bottom of the screen. You can check it out there. All right, let's do it. That is the wrong one. Desktop 2. There we go.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time we took a look at the second half of Aristotle and his further developments of the axial ages understanding of meaning and wisdom. And we took a look more at what you might call the world side of things. And we took a look at Aristotle's worldview, the two components, his conformity theory, which is an important alternative understanding of knowledge. It's a contact epistemology, intimate knowing and being with something, and how plausible that contact epistemology actually is. And then we also looked at a plausible, turned out to be false, but a plausible model of the world that is very consonant and consistent with that conformity theory. This is a world, a geocentric world that is moved by natural motion. It's a cosmos. And then we use that to discuss how the theory of the world and the theory of how we know the world and be within the world are intimately connected and mutually supporting. And you get worldview attunement and how that creates existential modes in which we are co-identifying the agent and the arena and creating the meta-meaning, the relationship that makes all individual acts and events and situations and places meaningful for us. And how important that consonance is between our existential mode and our intellectual understanding, and why Aristotle is so prominent because of his capacity to create a worldview that lasts for a millennium and being so well attuned a worldview. We then paused from our discussion of the axial age in Greece, and we moved to the axial age in India for the explicit purpose of trying to discuss the impact of the mindfulness revolution. And the part of the thesis of the series is the mindfulness revolution is a response to the meaning crisis in the West, and the growing confluence between Buddhism and cognitive science is an attempt to address and provide solutions to the meaning crisis in the West. We started by looking at the figure who epitomizes the axial revolution within ancient India, and that's Siddhartha Gautama. And we began by looking at his myth, his mythological biography, if you want to put it that way. And I remind you again how I am using the word myth. And we began by taking a look at his early life within the palace. We stepped aside and examined the palace as a mythological representation of a particular existential mode. We talked about two different existential modes following the work of Fromm. It's also convergent of work from Buber and other important thinkers. Stephen Batchelor is going to make use of this distinction, etc. Fromm talks about two modes, two existential modes: the having mode, that's organized around meeting our having needs, in which we perceive the world categorically. We want to manipulate it and solve our problems and control it. And the being mode, which is organized around our being needs. These are needs that are met by becoming something mature, virtuous, love. And we then talked about the possibilities of modal confusion, being locked in the having mode and trying to meet your being needs within the having mode. So trying to meet your need for maturity by having a car, or meeting your need for being in love by having lots of sex. And we talked about the fact that you can become enmeshed in modal confusion, and how that becomes a vicious cycle, because as your being needs are frustrated, you pursue evermore the misframed projects that the modal confusion is giving you. You try more and more to have things as opposed to more and more become what you need to become. And then I suggested to you that being in the palace is a mythological representation of this kind of modal confusion in which we are stuck in the having mode. And of course, this also had one important cultural point, and I did say at the beginning that we would talk about we would develop a way of talking about the connections between the meaning crisis and other crises we are facing. So issues about a market economy and a commodification of everything and everyone. By inducing modal confusion, it is possible to sell you more. And as your identity becomes more and more a political and economic thing and commodity that should be categorically understood and manipulated, the more and more I can sell you things and sell you ideas and manipulate you accordingly. So this has important ramifications for us now. That's why it's a myth, because it has important ramifications for us right now. But as I mentioned, Siddhartha does not stay in the palace. His curiosity becomes too great. And there are all kinds of variations on this story. And I don't think there is an absolute canonical way of saying it. But he decides to leave the palace. He goes out in his chariot with his charioteer Chandra, and they're traveling around, and he sees a sick person. And he's distressed. What's wrong with that person? Well, and Chandra says, "My lord, he's sick." And Siddhartha said, "Well, what did he do to cause that?" And it's like, nothing. It's just, it happens to everybody. Everybody gets sick at some point. It's just part of the way of things. You can see this is the axial awakening, right? Remember, the axial revolution is awakening about what's actually going on in the suffering in the world. And so Siddhartha is like very distressed. It's like, what? But I could get sick too? And Chandra said, well, of course. Of course. I mean, part of the conceit of the myth is that Chandra is sort of oblivious to Siddhartha's whole history, which is, of course, unbelievable. But that's the point of a myth. It's to get you to realize things, not to convince you about historical truths. So Siddhartha is distressed, and he says, "Take me away from here. I don't want to see this anymore." And so they drive along, and they meet an old person. And Siddhartha says, "Stop! Is that person sick as well?" "No, my lord. He's not sick. He's old." "Old? What do you mean?" "Well, this happens to everyone through the passage of time." "You mean he didn't do anything in particular?" "No, it wasn't any. It's not his fault. He's become old." And now Siddhartha's like, "No, okay, let's go back to the palace. This is really bad." So they're making their way back to the palace. He's trying to return to that self-enclosure of the pure having mode. But that's the thing about confusion. Once it starts to be dissipated, you can't return to it. So he's trying to return, and of course, he meets a funeral procession. There's a corpse. And Siddhartha said, is that person sick? Are they old?" So, "No, that person's dead. They're dead. They're not alive anymore." "What? But why?" He said, "Well, my lord, it happens to everybody." Now, do you see what's happened here? The having mode has been completely undermined. It's been completely undermined. And so Siddhartha is experiencing an existential crisis because this is happening at the level of his existential mode. That's what it means when we talk about an existential crisis. So he's like, "Get me back to the palace, absolutely now." And so now there's a mad dash. And as he's trying to get back to the palace and trying to enfold himself back into that world, he meets one more person actually. He meets a mendicant. He meets one of these people that has given up the having mode. They were called renouncers because they have renounced the world of the palace, of luxury. And there's a deep peace in this man's eyes. And the contrast, right? And think about how, again, this is not just a matter of belief. This is happening in his entire being. His entire being is resonating with this distress because it's the whole way in which he is coupled to the world that has been suddenly thrown into confusion. There's all of this happening, this deep distress, and the contrast with the peace that he sees in the man's eyes. And he turns to Chandra and says, "Who is this?" And Chandra said, "It's a mendicant. It's a wandering person." And that person, of course, is the introduction, not the intellectual introduction, but the direct confrontation with the being mode. This is a person who has realized peace. And Siddhartha feels that contrast poignantly, powerfully, painfully. So he returns to the palace, with these four signs burning in him: the illness, the old age, the death, but also this representative of the being mode, somebody who has cultivated wisdom and peace, found some kind of deep connectedness that is untouched by the vicissitudes of our mortality. But of course, Siddhartha cannot find the peace he wants. He cannot get back to the palace. Look, think about the double senses of this word, because it's really pertinent here. Disillusionment. When we describe somebody as disillusioned, we're usually talking about a state in which they are perhaps moving towards despair. They're sad, they've experienced loss. It's a negative state. But notice at the heart of it is the loss of illusion. This is an axial age thing. He is losing the illusion of modal confusion, and he's losing that sense of belonging that he had when he was in the palace. He doesn't belong there anymore. He tries to make it work. We're going to talk about this later. We're going to talk about this. Why is it after people have these kinds of awakening experiences, they feel that they need to transform their whole lives, that they can't go back, that there's something irreversible about it? This is something we're going to directly talk about. In fact, can we get a cognitive scientific purchase on that? But he can't go back. The disillusionment is too real. So he decides to leave. And this is not an easy choice. He has a wife, he has a child. And we may, in fact, even ethically criticize him. I mean, he's abandoning his son, he's abandoning his wife. But there's a sense here that, and of course we should make moral reflection, we should make moral arguments. But what the myth is saying is the moral life sits upon something deeper. That carrying out your moral responsibilities, while important, of course, can ultimately be rendered meaningless if you've lost meaning. Morality depends upon your life being meaningful. And we're going to talk about this a lot later when we talk about the work of Susan Wolf and others. Meaning in life and the psychological work about this right now. Meaning in life is different from, and I would argue that this myth says is deeper than, simply leading a moral existence. See, there's something more to wisdom than just morality. See, virtue is also about, right, that meaningfulness, that meta-meaning. It's ultimately about being plugged into the cultivation of wisdom, not just doing what is morally correct. So, Siddhartha leaves the palace. He cuts his hair, leaves the palace, goes into the forest, and he decides to follow the path of the renouncers and try to cultivate a solution to the fear and the turmoil that is still reverberating within him. So he pursues he meets up with various teachers, and he pursues various things. But he gets into another troubled spot. Because although he leaves the palace, there's an important sense in which he hasn't left the having mode. Because he's still carrying that confusion. Because what he's pursuing is he's pursuing asceticism. He's trying to subject the body to tremendous trial and pain. Trying to bring it into complete submission So he's practicing self-denial. I mean, you can see why this would make sense, right? The palace was all about self-indulgence, so surely the solution is self-denial. I mean, that seems reasonable. Think about how often we do these swings between self-indulgence and self-denial. So he starves himself to the point where you can see his spine from the front of his body because his belly is so withdrawn and gaunt, it's pressing against the vertebrae of his back. He looks like some anemic specter in representations we have of him from that period. But it's not working. It's not working. Because do you see what's still going wrong? Do you see it? Trying to annihilate the self is still thinking about having a self. He's still in the having mode. He's just transferred it from having bodily things to trying to have his self. Yes, he's trying to throw it away, but he's still framing it in the having mode. He's still understanding the problem in the having mode. He is still modally confused. Self-denial is as much an aspect of this confusion as self-indulgence, because it's merely the negation of self-indulgence. It is not its transcendence. When you negate something, you are still framing it in the same way. So he's sitting on the banks of a river, and he's fatiguing. And he hears a barge going down the river, and there's a musician playing, and the musician has his apprentice. And it's a lyre, a stringed instrument of some kind. And he's saying to the apprentice, no, 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 listen. Listen to me. The strings can't be too tight and they can't be too loose. Too tight is just as bad as too loose. And think about Aristotle, right? Think about Aristotle, right, where at the golden mean, which doesn't mean just the middle point in some sort of average. And I say that because of how this has come to be understood. This is when Siddhartha discovers the middle path. It doesn't mean some, compromising, middling solution. It means a radical reformation. Right? The middle path is to transcend the having mode by rejecting both self-indulgence and its negation, self-denial. Right? We're going to talk about this a lot more when we talk about optimization strategies. We talked about it, remember, when we talked about flow. You're not trying to maximize, you're trying to optimize. You're trying to get the right connectedness. And that's what the being mode's all about. It's about being connected in the right way. So Siddhartha has this realization. In the story, the realization has come, he tumbles into the river and he's drowning, and a little girl saves him, which is, in the culture of the time, that's extremely demeaning for a man who was once a prince to be saved by a little girl. Right? It points to the radicalness of the change that's occurring for him. She gives him sort of the equivalent of rice pudding. That's why on Bodhi Day, Buddhists will often eat rice pudding to celebrate that fact. So he realizes he must pursue the middle path. He must find a way of optimizing his cognition that allows him to transcend and rediscover this missing mode, the mode that he saw in the eyes of the mendicant. Now, this is important because this is the word for that kind of remembering, sati. It means to remember, to remind, not just like a fact. It means to bring it to mind. So this is a modal memory. This is remembering a lost mode of being. This is not remembering some fact or event. This is remembering what it is like to be in the being mode. It is to recover a mode. It is a deep kind of restructuring of your being. It doesn't mean just simply remembering or reminding yourself. It's like when you go back to a place that you haven't been for a while and you start to recover and remember an identity you used to have there. While you were away from the place, you remember the facts and the event, but when you go there, right, this is what it was like to be me at this time. It's that kind of remembering. It's a modal memory, right? It has to do with that participatory knowing we were talking about. Siddhartha is trying to remember the being mode. It's in the eyes of the renouncer. Now, why do I bring this word up and go on about this? Because this is the word that is translated today by this term, mindfulness. But I bet you when I say mindfulness, especially if you're in touch with this revolution that is sweeping our culture, you probably didn't think of remembering the being mode. Now, there are some astute authors who describe it that way. Stephen Batchelor did in a beautiful little book called Alone with Others that I heartily recommend. Siddhartha is going to pick up on these psychotechnologies of mindfulness that he's learned from his teachers, but he found inadequate because he's going to transform them because he precisely wants to remember. He wants to recover, it's a better word, I would think, the being mode. Not as an intellectual idea, but as his very agency and the very way in which the world is realized in conjunction and co-identification with that agency. So, I want to stop now this story. We're going to pick it up on what Siddhartha does in order to bring about this recovery. But I'm going to give you one way of thinking about it that we're going to build towards. Another way in which you remember in this sense of sati is when you wake up. Remember, we talked about this as one of the metaphors, the myths that people use for talking about self-transcendence. There's enlightenment, there's waking up, there's going from being a child to an adult. We'll come back to these again and again. But why? When I wake up, this is not like when I just remembered an event, when I, like right now, and I remember, oh yes, I know it's out the hall. When I wake up, I recover my world and my identity. I deeply remember. And even look at what this word means. To belong to be a member. I belong again to myself and to the world. That's what happens when I'm waking up. And Siddhartha wants a mindfulness psychotechnology, in fact, not just a psychotechnology, a set of psychotechnologies that are going to help him remember, recover, sati, the being mode. He is going to awaken. And that's, in fact, what his title means. Buddha is not a name. Buddha is a title. It means the awakened one. But we need to talk about the cognitive science of mindfulness because we are here looking at Siddhartha precisely because of the mindfulness revolution that's happening here and now today. And the mindfulness revolution is a response to the meaning crisis. And we can see why it is. Even better if we resituate it within Siddhartha's myth. Because we see that he's cultivating mindfulness to cultivate awakening, because awakening is a way of responding to the meaning crisis. Hence the title of this series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. But as a cognitive scientist, I'm critical. I'm both appreciative of all of the scientific work that's being done on mindfulness, but I'm also critical of it, as a good scientist should be. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can understand and better formulate what mindfulness means. And this is based on work that I published in 2016 with Leo Ferraro on mindfulness. So again, why am I doing this? If we want to awaken from the meaning crisis, if we want to understand what Siddhartha's awakening was, we've got to understand what mindfulness meant to him. And what it meant to him is precisely the set of psychotechnologies that brings about awakening. And part of what I want to show is how can we get back to an understanding of mindfulness and its constitutive psychotechnologies that will afford precisely that. How can we get a deeper understanding of the cognitive processes at work in mindfulness and how they can afford such important existential transformation? So if you ask people who are pursuing mindfulness practices, meditation, contemplative practices, I'll try and argue later why those shouldn't be treated as synonyms, for example, even though they often are. They'll give you a sort of standard understanding of what mindfulness is. And what I want you to first note is how much it is not picking up on what we've already said about sati. So people will tell you that to be mindful, what you're trying to do is pay attention to the present moment in a non-judgmental fashion. Trying to learn how to notice. There's a hint. Look, there's this hint of the being mode, remembering the being mode still there, because they'll say it's about being present. They're invoking, right, the being mode, but they're doing it in a way that, while helpful, is maybe misleading. Now, I want to make sure that you're understanding what I'm criticizing, what I'm not criticizing. In order to do that, let me tell you a little bit more. I both study mindfulness scientifically and do work on it, experiments and publish theoretical work on it. I also teach. I teach it, as I mentioned. I teach meditative practices, I teach contemplative practices, and I teach extracurricular Tai Chi Chuan, which is a form of moving mindfulness. So I am familiar with both the academic attempt to explain mindfulness and the pedagogical attempt to teach it. And I think it's important to have a foot in both of those worlds to realize a way in which you can become confused in your attempts to understand mindfulness. We need to avoid confusion by making a distinction. We avoid modal confusion by recovering the distinction between the having mode and the being mode. We can get deeply confused about mindfulness if we do not remember the distinction between the language of training and the language of explaining. This is the language I use when I'm teaching people meditation and contemplation and Tai Chi. I use language that helps them acquire the skills. And this is language of imitation and involvement, and I can depend on our presence together. I can depend on the pragmatics of the situation. I can depend on the fact that their goal is that they want to acquire the skill. And so I'll use language there that's appropriate for that. But if I was simply to use that language unquestioningly here, I would make a mistake. Let me give you an example. And I'm going to use an example from memory because of the connections I'm making between mindfulness and memory. One of the most powerful ways you can train your memory is to use what's known as the method of location, or the method of loci if you want to sound more pretentious. Okay? So some of you might have watched the Sherlock series. Sherlock does this with his mind palace, right? So what you do is you memorize a space. You memorize the rooms, right? So you can visualize them in your mind. And then if I want to I want to remember a bunch of things. Let's say I want to remember stuff associated with Socrates. Then I have a figure of Socrates here, and then I put a bunch of other images there in that location. And then now I want to remember some stuff about Plato, and I have some other things here, some other images, and I put a bunch of images sort of with Plato, and so forth. And then what I do in order to remember what I need to remember, I call this up, I go into this room, and I have all the images, and they're all tightly associated together, and I get all the information I need from Socrates, and then I go, and then I move in my mind palace to where the Plato room is, and I unfold it. And this is powerful. The orators of the ancient world could use the method of locations, right, in order to memorize speeches that would last up to 6 hours. And we know that this is a very powerful mnemonic. You should, if you're a student and you're studying, learn how to use this. It's not just how to become a sociopathic superhero detective. It is a good way to become a student, the method of locations. Now, notice this. It is powerful language of training. It trains your memory well. Now, what you may do, and this would be a mistake, is you may think this is how memory is organized. This is called the spatial metaphor of memory. You may think, oh, well, this is how memory is organized. All my memories, for one thing, are sort of stable things, like my image of Socrates. They're in a stable location, and all the things that, that are associated in my memory are actually closer together in my memory. So the way memory works is I send in a little homunculus, a little memory guy, and he searches through the rooms until he finds the right room, and then he goes in the room, and everything's organized there, and he finds what he needs, and then he brings it out, and then he passes it up to consciousness, and that's how I remember, right? And we talk about searching through our memory and retrieving from our memory. Here's the thing, and Isaac and Keene pointed out this a long time ago. The spatial metaphor for memory is almost completely wrong. Your memory does not work this way. It doesn't work this way. That's a mistake. Here, I'll show you. Right? So tell me quickly, other colors associated with blue. You'll say red, green. Tell me other words that rhyme with blue. Shoe, new. Okay, so red is close to blue and shoe is close to blue. Yes? So that means what else is close? Shoe and red. So when I say shoe, you should think of red. Do you? Of course you don't. Here's another way in which your memory isn't laid out this way. You rapidly know when you don't know something. What's Meryl Streep's phone number? I don't know. Have you ever been in Bangkok? No. Well, what did Bob do? Did he get on like some sort of hyperspace motorcycle inside your, what did he, did he go to every place you've ever been? Is that Bangkok? Is that Bangkok? Is that Bangkok? No. He instantly knows, you instantly know, that you weren't in Bangkok. He instantly knows that you don't have Meryl Streep's phone number. He doesn't search all the space. In fact, it looks like he doesn't search it at all. Okay. Memory is a lot more mysterious, and it does not operate in the simplistic manner that the spatial metaphor says. That spatial metaphor is great for training your language, for training your memory. It is great for training your memory, but it is overly simplistic and gets you to misunderstand, listen to my language, how memory actually works. The language by which we train mindfulness should not be imported critically into our scientific attempts to explain it and understand it. Paying attention to the present moment. First of all, I have to know what it is to pay attention. I'm going to show you that that's way more problematic than you think it, because you're probably thinking it's operating according to another metaphor, shining a spotlight. I pay attention the way I shine a spotlight. What's the present moment? I mean, when I'm training you, we can sort of just make it happen because we can rely on the content. But what's the present moment? Is it right here, right now? That's that nanosecond? This second? The last 5 minutes? The last hour? What's the present moment? See, the word present doesn't have a particular meaning. It's called an indexical. It's relative to what I'm considering. What's here? What's now? You see, and people think, oh, well, I can tell you what being the present moment is. It's paying attention to the here and now. That's useless. What's here? This spot I'm standing on? This room? This city of Toronto? This solar system? This universe out of all of the universes in the multiverse? What's now? See, you're not explaining anything. That language helps train people, but it's overly simplistic and misleading when we're trying to understand. What we need to do is reformulate mindfulness, and we need to do it in order to recover what Siddhartha was talking about. How can we understand mindfulness such that it can tell us how people can become awakened? That's what we need. That's how we have to reformulate mindfulness. So let's try and do that. Let's make use of some of the things we've already built upon here. We can bring in Plato to help us, and what a great ally that is to have. Because do you remember what Plato pointed out? That our knowledge is not captured just by a list of features. Remember, the bird isn't just the wings, the feather, the beak. It's also the structural functional organization. The thing is, if you look at most people's definition of mindfulness, even in scientific articles, all they give you is a feature list. To be mindful is being present, which we've got to do something about because that's just language of training. It's not explanatory language, right? Not judging. And then that's going to be problematic. What do you mean not judging? I'm supposed to pay attention to my breath and not pay attention to my distractions. That's a kind of judging. What do you mean not judging? Well, right. What does it mean? It's somehow supposed to bring about, right, something like insight. And that's going to be important because insight, I'm going to argue, is on a continuum with awakening. I'll explain what that means. And it's supposed to reduce your reactivity. You're supposed to become more equanimous, more balanced. So, mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment, right? Being present, paying attention to the present moment in a non-judgmental fashion that's supposed to bring about insight. The form of meditation I teach, the Buddhist form, it's claimed it goes back to Siddhartha. It's called Vipassana. Vipassana means insight. Obviously not just an intellectual insight, but an existential insight, right? It's supposed to reduce reactivity. What does that mean? Now that's a feature list. We're missing the IDOS. We're missing the structural functional organization that tells me how all of those things actually go together. So this is what we need to do. We need to turn this feature list into a feature schema. We need to recover its missing structural functional organization. And we need to reinterpret all of these things so we can actually explain their functionality. And we need to do that by tying them to independently constructed theoretical claims within psychology. Look, we have people who are doing the psychology and the cognitive science of attention, of insight, of improved self-regulation. Let's pay attention, no pun intended, to what they're telling us about how insight, attention, self-control operate. So one of the things you do to turn a feature list into a feature schema is you make some distinctions between the types of features. So here's, of these core four that we keep seeing a lot, being present, not judging, or non-judging, right, insight, right, and reduced reactivity. I've split them up like this because there's a distinction here. These are states that I can get into, right? These are things I can do. So being present is something I can do. I can start it, I can stop it. We're going to have to come back to what it means. But we know it's an activity you're engaging in because it's constantly being disrupted while you're meditating, and you're constantly having to engage in it again. And the same thing with not judging. Not judging is something you're doing. It's a weird kind of paradoxical not doing. But again, you can start it, it can stop, you can restart it again. But these are not things you're doing. These are results. So to use the language of psychology, these are states you can get into, but these are traits that you cultivate. You want to become more insightful. You want to become less reactive. So immediately we understand, oh wait, so these are things I do, and these are traits that I'm supposed to be realized when I'm cultivating mindfulness. Now questions immediately emerge. By making this distinction, I can ask this question: how does being present cause insight? Or how does being present reduce reactivity? Does non-judging cause insight? Does non-judging cause reduced reactivity? What's the causal relation? Notice that the feature list doesn't talk about this at all. It doesn't talk about how the features are causally related. It doesn't talk about how the states can cause the traits. But it also doesn't ask constitutive questions. Constitutive questions are part-whole relationships. What's this? Is this a part of this? Is this a part of this? Are they both part of some whole? What's that? What's the structural relationship here? What about these? Is this part of this? Is this part of this? Are they both part of some whole? See, the feature list does not have the IDOS. And by not having the IDOS, or not looking for the IDOS, it's not asking any of these questions, these causal and constitutive questions. Now, as we start to answer these questions, and as we start to answer them with the language of explaining rather than the language of explaining, we will turn a feature list into a feature schema. We will start to get at the structural functional organization of mindfulness, and we'll start to get a deeper understanding of it. And that will help us to see how it is that mindfulness can bring about the kind of radical transformations that were promised by Siddhartha's realization. All right. So I'm going to focus on this one right now. And again, we'll start by talking about specific insights, but obviously we're not talking about this insight or that insight. We're talking about a fundamental existential, modal kind of transformation. Okay, I've already said this language is useless. People say, okay, well, what I meant was something like concentration. That can't be right. That's not good enough. Because if you take a look at Siddhartha's attempt to explain it, he talks about right concentration. That's why I have concentration here. Right? If Siddhartha is telling you that there's right concentration, what does that strongly mean? That there is wrong concentration. Mindfulness isn't about concentration, it's about getting the right kind of concentration. What does that mean? Well, it means paying attention. Okay. Right? Again, you're using a particular model for attention. Let's talk about these two things a little bit, and let's talk about, right? Let's talk about what Siddhartha and when he's hearing not too tight, not too loose for the strings. First of all, let's work our way up phenomenologically. I want you to compare two ways of concentrating. This is based on work done by Ellen Langer, who wrote probably the first book on mindfulness in the West called Mindfulness in like 1988, way before the mindfulness revolution took off. And there's a lot of questions about what's the relationship between her account of mindfulness and the Buddhists. I'm not getting into that right now because that's not what I'm trying to establish. I'm just using her way of trying to get you to understand concentration. Okay, so we're going to do it right here, right now. Okay, so I want you to concentrate on my finger. Concentrate on it. Concentrate. Concentrate. Concentrate on my finger. Concentrate. Don't let your mind wander. Concentrate. Okay, so most of you found that unpleasant. And because notice what the metaphor even says. This is what I'm doing. I'm concentrating. I'm making my mind into a tunnel, and then I'm sort of sticking it on something and trying to keep it there, not let it move. Right? And the only training you were given was what I was doing, yelling. Concentrate. Concentrate. Okay, let's do it. Let's do something else. Okay, ready? Okay, I want you to look at my finger. I want you to notice that it's not actually perfectly straight. It's bent a little bit, and it's a little bit thicker at the bottom than at the top, and there are sort of multiple sections to it, and it's a little bit red on one side. It's very different, wasn't it? She calls that soft vigilance, because what you're doing there is not externally hardening your mind and sticking it on things. What you're doing is constantly trying to renew your interest. And this is a great word. This comes from, right, interesse, to be within something. To be within something. It's about that conformity that Aristotle was talking about. What you're doing is constantly exploring and opening it up. Right? So we need a model of concentration that does this soft vigilance, that's constantly renewing your interest, getting you deeply involved with something, because it's going to get you intimately in contact with it. So, what kind of attention are we talking about? And, right, we don't want too hard. Those are the strings too hard. Concentrate, concentrate, concentrate. Strings are too hard, too tight. Oh, just do whatever you want. That's too loose. How can we, look, notice how when I had you sort of move over my finger, it's almost like a well-tuned string. It's almost got this musicality of intelligibility to it. Well, now you need to understand what's going on with attention, because what I want to show you is attention isn't a spotlight. It's a very complex optimization process. It's really about tuning and getting between too tight and too loose, and allow you to becoming intimately involved, conformed to, participating, interesse with whatever you're paying attention to. Okay, so why do we like the spotlight metaphor? It's even in you'll find it in psychology textbooks. Attention is like a spotlight. Right? Well, because one of the things that attention does is captured very well by the spotlight metaphor. Look, when I shine a light on something, it makes that stand out. It makes it stand out because it's brighter. Remember when things stand out, that's salience? It makes things more salient. That's what attention does. It makes things more salient. Attention is about, right, now we're getting something. And that's what I was doing here. I was making things salient to you. Features of my finger more salient to you. What's wrong with the spotlight? Well, what's wrong with the spotlight metaphors? Well, it picks up on that attention is about optimizing salience. It's missing so much of what that optimization actually is and how it can be connected to insight. So some excellent work done by Christopher Mole. Again, very complex argument, and I'm not going to try and go through the whole thing, but try to get into an understanding that attention isn't something you directly do. Let me try and give you a comparison here. Walk and practice. See, walking is something I can ask you to directly do. I can say, walk, and you walk. Start walking. Stop walking. Start walking again. Great. But if I say to you, practice, come on, practice, you should say to me, practice what? See, you practice something by optimizing how you're doing something else. If I'm practicing chess, I'm not playing chess and doing some other thing, practicing. To practice chess is to optimize how I play chess. To practice tennis is not to do tennis and some additional secret action, practicing. What I'm doing when I'm practicing tennis is optimizing how I play tennis. Now, Mole's point is you don't directly pay attention. But it's not obvious to you that that's the case because of both the prevalence of the metaphor and how skilled you are at paying attention. But this is how you pay attention. You pay attention by optimizing some other process. That's why when I ask you to pay attention, I can be asking you to do many different things. I can ask you to pay attention, and it means optimize your seeing so that it becomes looking and watching. I can ask you to pay attention, and it means optimize your hearing so that it becomes listening. I can ask you to pay attention, and that means doing the two together, optimizing your looking and your listening, and so that they're coordinated well together. But notice if I say to you, I want you to pay attention, but I don't want you to do that by optimizing or improving anything else you're doing. I don't want you to pay attention by improving your looking or your listening or your remembering. I just want you to directly pay attention. Come on, do it right now. Pay attention. You don't know what to do. See, you pay attention by optimizing other things you're doing. Now, Mole talks about this as cognitive unison. When we're optimizing, what we're trying to do is coordinate various processes so that they're sharing the same goal and working well together. Think about Plato's idea about getting various different systems to work well together. So what we need to understand is, what is attention? How is it optimizing? How is it integrating things together? How does that get improved in mindfulness practice, and how does it bring about insight? Not just an insight into this problem or this problem, but the insight, the systematic insight that is awakening, that motivates and empowers people to radically transform themselves so that they can escape from modal confusion and other existential dilemmas. We'll take a look at that next time. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, that was a good one.
You're muted.
Am I muted? No, I'm not.
It says you're muted.
Oh, that's Zoom. Don't worry about it. Yeah, really good one. I say that every week, but I love how deep he gets into describing mindfulness. And there are some ideas, especially the one about the spotlight of awareness.
Being the wrong metaphor.
Yeah, that was a good one. All right, so we'll do the discussion in, let's see, I got to pull up the page. Intermission. In 9 minutes and 50 seconds. And if you guys could go to the link right now, there's a waiting room set up. Because
Can't hear you, it says.
Really?
You're muted in Zoom.
No, it's not Zoom. It's not Zoom. Who says they can't hear us?
Oh, maybe can. Maybe that.
Okay,
means
yeah.
can.
All right. Fuck. What was I saying? Please go to futurethinkers.org/discuss, and that will put you in the waiting room for Zoom. The stream is like a minute or almost 2 minutes ahead, or behind, I should say, real time. So if you guys can go into that link right now. There's one more thing I wanted to say that Heather brought up last week that I thought was really good. probably some of you will have been watching the past discussions and maybe will feel like a little nervous to participate, or that you can't keep up. I really want to encourage you to join in on this discussion because first of all, there are no such thing as dumb questions. Like, if you have a question, there's a good chance other people will have the same question, and you will help everyone get the answer by asking that question. So don't worry about being perceived as dumb or anything. Like, no one will think that in this group. Just join. Try and have a bit of courage to be able to jump into this thing and not know, and just ask questions. It's really valuable to other people. So, yeah.
And the other thing is that we're trying to do here what John Vervaeke is pointing to. It's about participatory knowing. It's not about sounding smart or understanding all the concepts. It's about participating in this group sense making that we're trying to do here. So.
Yeah, exactly. So again, that's futurethinkers.org/discuss. If you don't have Zoom, you'll need to download that, and that will take you to the waiting room. I'll let everyone in like a few seconds before we start the discussion. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So we'll see you in a bit.
futurethinkers.org/discuss.
Yeah. Hey guys,
Hello,
how's it
hello.
going? I don't hear anyone.
You don't hear me?
Okay, I hear you. Good. Yeah, that was a good recommendation from Heather last week. Increase the participation rate. How's everyone doing? What do you think of this one? Any volunteers? Anyone can start. And go. I can hear someone's got the stream going. Just make sure your Chrome is muted. David, I'll pick on you then.
All right. Yeah, I love that there's some nuance that I get this time about the being mode and remembering the being mode that that I don't think hit me as deeply the first time. Sati, mindfulness, is about remembering the being mode, and that's such a deep, that his example is such a good one when it's focusing on the finger, and how do you do that, and renewing interest, that he touches base on that last week with wonder and curiosity, right? Kind of continuing to move into the present moment of what am I actually experiencing, and it comes to mind that the subtlety of the having mode is really hard to notice, right? It's like the conceptual space, even some of the initial discussion in the YouTube channel about Buddha or whatever is like this having mode. Oh, I know what Buddha is, and I know what this is about. Da 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 da. It's like, hold on, what's actually happening right now?
Mm.
What are we learning about this and newly as it's arising? What is my experience of this right now? What's my interest and wonder and curiosity in this moment right now? Not simply relying on what I have as a previous map of what I think about all of this. And it's amazing how challenging it is to continue to renew that. How easily I slip into that, right?
It's that state and process thing all over again. It keeps coming up every single conversation we have.
And it's interesting how this is very deeply related to meaning as well, because by continuously renewing interest, we keep going back to that kind of childlike beginner mind where everything is fascinating, everything is amazing, everything is meaningful. And it's just right there, right?
And therefore easier to remember too, because the emotional component is there. Your emotional involvement in everything.
Yeah, but once you remember, it's what David was saying. We have to not slip into that, oh yeah, I already know this habit.
Yeah, the other part of it is the curiosity with the way that I also love the what did he call it, the location based memory, looking at the rooms and thinking of that. I remember the first time that I saw that, it was such an interesting notion that, yeah, that seems right, yeah, I know this because of the associations. It's like, wait a minute, how do you know that you don't know Meryl Streep's phone number? You don't have to search anything like that, you just know you don't know that. Or it's like there's a very different experience of that. It's I mentioned last week, I think I mentioned last week, the notion from drawing on the right side of the brain, the notion that when you're drawing, one of the biggest challenges is actually seeing, right? Not drawing from the image that you have in your mind of what you're seeing, but actually using your eyes and seeing what it is that's in front of you. And drawing is an interesting way of demonstrating that, but it's so much more subtle than that. The challenge of actually experiencing what's arising and me with all of my experience and what I'm seeing, and the way that I'm making sense of it without my memories of that thing clouding it. It was interesting because there's a notion here as well. The comment, morals related to, what was that you,
Wisdom.
Eric? No, wisdom. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, morals and wisdom, right? Now, I don't think that morals is related to wisdom, and it's like there is, or actually it was a little bit before that. I don't remember, but anyway, the specific thought of, wait a minute, how do you morals are about your framing and relative. You can't just be in the present moment all the time and really have a sense morals as well, which is interesting, right? There's something very subtle about that is worth looking at, but seems tricky to actually be in the presence of.
There was an implication in that comment that morals are just universal, which is what I was trying to respond to. It's rather than being something that you investigate and come to some wisdom on through experience. It's like, I think it was implied that we all have the same morals, or that we're coming from something that is implicit.
I think that the point that meaning is deeper than morality is very important, actually, because morals are constructs, and some of them are constructed more similarly in different parts of the world, and some of them are not. But at the end of the day, they are constructs that we, agree upon in different societies to a degree. But yeah, they're not universal, and they rest on our ability to find things meaningful. Otherwise, morals just completely disintegrate, which is why, actually, I wanted to make a reference to the Joker movie. So when he starts to lose his grip on meaning, his sense of morality also disintegrates. It's because morality rests on top of meaning, not the other way around. And which is also why, not just Joker in the movie, but also why people who go through intense bouts of nihilism can commit very immoral acts without remorse, because that sense of meaning is required for us to have morality.
I went through moral disintegration when I was in nihilism, and it was very weird to kind of lose a grip on everything that I had valued for my whole life, and to question whether other people even mattered, whether I should bother considering other people at all. It was such a strange thing to have my morals disappear, and thankfully the situation I was in and everything else did not lead to me doing anything terrible while I was in that state. But I think it's absolutely, there's a very, very strong, it's like stronger than a link. It's like they're just fused. It's fused to meaning. As soon as meaning's gone, if everything's meaningless, why does it matter how you treat people or what you do? It doesn't.
This, to me, seems to relate to what Jordan Peterson was talking about when he said, if you don't know that you can harm someone, it doesn't mean that you're good. Like, if you're just a harmless person, it doesn't mean that you're good. It's to know what you're capable of and experience the depths of your own evil and then choose not to do harm is true. I don't know if he would have used the word virtue, but I forget what it was.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I would also tie it in with Jordan Peterson says, a lot of people who were either bullied or they had very aggressive parents can tend to take a morality of agreeableness, non-conflict ever in any circumstance, and they won't even stand up for themselves. I think that's being oppressive. I've had some kind of personal experience with that, and I really like the point Jordan Peterson makes about you have to learn how to cope with your aggression. You can't just suppress it. Otherwise, it can just come out kind of like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde when you don't want it to. And also a bit of a tangent, but that point of meaning is deeper than morality. I'm kind of thinking about this backwards, but whether some of these totalitarian regimes purposefully eradicate meaning to make people less moral, and you can use that as a tool.
Well, there was a point at the beginning of the lecture, actually, and he touched on that in previous lectures, that by having people be confused about the being mode and the having mode does exactly that.
I'm sorry, I missed the start of the lecture.
But yeah, it eradicates meaning for people because when they're not participating in their own knowing of the world, where they're just taking everything as like intellectual or as given as a concept rather than as felt knowing of something, they can be fed any bullshit.
Yeah.
Maybe we can just take a second to define the difference between being and having in terms of last week's lecture.
Mm-hmm. Well, the having mode is like when you have concepts, when you have ideas, when you own objects that you can define. And being mode is more about participating in something, knowing how it feels. Like when you wake up, that's why they use the metaphor of awakening. It's like, you're awake, not because you have some sort of a knowledge, but because of the felt sense of what it's like to be awake.
And there was this idea last week that I don't know if it was specifically marketers, but marketers
Yes.
and governments will
Politicians.
intentionally confuse being and having.
Mm-hmm. They'll try to sell you things that should be provided for by your being needs as a having mode thing.
Something you can buy, a feeling you can buy.
So, for example, people have a need for maturation, and instead of like providing the tools for people to actually become mature adults, companies will try to sell you markers of adulthood, like cars, mortgages, loans, whatever is the kind of cultural meaning of adulthood. Or same thing with sex. Like Tinder tries to sell you the idea of love, but just with hookup culture. But it doesn't fill the hole. It feels empty. So that's the difference between the having and the being mode. And it's the same with everything. Like in the food industry, it's the same. They try to sell you food that tastes good, but actually is not nutritious. It doesn't provide for the being need of being healthy.
Could you say social media kind of makes you have friends, but it's not making you be a friend to people?
Exactly.
It's almost entirely about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about signaling.
Yeah. Signaling how many likes you have, how many friends you have, how many retweets you get, how much attention people pay to you, instead of actual, deep, meaningful relationships.
Because as much as I don't like the critical theory, Frankfurt School side of philosophy, I think Baudrillard had a book about hyperreality, how things get replaced with like symbols of things, representations of things. It's kind of like a decay. So you look at, I don't know about the countries you live in, but housing, like cost of housing compared to 40 years ago, to some degree, houses became a commodity rather than actually what you're doing to live in it.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but it sounds right on track.
I just wanted to pick something up from the comment about social media because it occurred to me that I've sort of been transitioning maybe over the last 4 or 5 months from a very having mode centered existence to a much more being mode centered existence. And my use of social media has completely changed. And so all the stuff that we typically associate with it, like you were talking about the likes and the retweets and all that, is much less salient to me. And I'm much more concerned with, it's almost like a digital extension of the way I interact with people in my ordinary life, and building relationships and having Zoom calls with people. And it's a much different experience of the same underlying technology. And I think the technology, sorry, what's your name? Who I'm just looking at the, oh, maybe he dropped off. I don't know what his name is. Who said that?
It's Anthony.
I'm still here.
But oh, are you? Okay, I've got to flip between screens on my tablet to see everyone. I think the technology does steer us towards having mode behavior because of all the dopamine loops and all that. But I think it is also possible to to sort of hijack the technology itself for being mode interactions in the world. It just takes a lot of, maybe, I don't want to say effort, maybe luck is the sense. Like you have to end up in a certain place.
Definitely
where
takes me
you're
conscious
approaching
effort.
it that way. Yeah.
Definitely takes a conscious effort on these social media.
I use the word intention.
Yeah, intention. That's
Practice.
perfect. Yeah, practice is good. Yeah, because it's not, once you practice the effort enough, it is not so effortful. But it did take a ton of practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like how in that statement that you just made, there's actually the distinction between approaching it from the being mode and the having mode. Because if you approach it from the having mode, you could say social media is useful or it's useless. Like you either have it or you don't have it. But if it's about the being mode, it's all about how you participate in it. And you can do it in whatever way you want. It can be meaningful, it can be insightful, it can be, a tool for development, a tool for connection. So it's about participating in it. And this is actually really interesting because when people talk about awakening experiences, sometimes they describe it as like entering a different reality, but actually it's just the experience of reality is different, but it's the same reality. So it's the same here. It's like, no, we don't need to, well, I mean, if we start participating in social media differently, it might make the social media evolve to fit those needs. It's that interplay with the agent and arena that they adapt to each other, right? But it's not actually necessary to build a new social media to start participating, if that makes sense.
I think that's very, very true, that we don't necessarily need a new social media platform to have this meaningful connection. And at the same time, they're not designed for the being, they're designed for the having. Yeah. They're like, I am trying to create a more being platform with the Idea Cafe and using existing like Facebook and YouTube to do that. And it's completely different.
Hi.
You did hear that, yeah. Subscribe to my channel.
That was cute.
Followers on our YouTube. And that is the exact, like, having a platform that's designed for the being, even if you're someone who's so used to having, right? I think we are seeking the having. When it's created for the having, it brings in everybody else. And I will mute myself now.
Well, this brings up, sorry.
No, go ahead.
This brings up in relation to the agent arena relationship, this is also an extension of the framing problem, right? Like what we're fundamentally talking about is reframing the same stuff that we're interacting with, so looking at it in a different light. And that in some ways, there's infinite number of potentials, combinatorially explosive number of options that are available to us. We tend to zero in and get narrowed in on a specific way of thinking about things, and that limits our perspective. But if we can learn how to expand the way that we look at things, there are any number of options available to us. And the idea is just don't get stuck in one way of behaving, of perceiving, of acting, because then you're essentially trapped. You're essentially an addict to a specific way of being.
Mm-hmm.
I really like what you're saying there, because I think what Vervaeke here is trying to get at is getting out of those symbolic representations of the world and creating more of a connection to the actual state of what's happening. Because what you were saying there about like the framing issue is, I find this fascinating, because for AI research in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, completely stalled out because they came across something called the frame problem, where they are trying to represent everything symbolically, and you could never get a machine to figure out what situation it was in and how it should behave, because all that you would be able to do is just add another frame to it, add another symbol outside of it, and you just basically end up with this recursive problem. And I love what Vervaeke is saying, what he's talking about Plato, and like the bird is more than a list of features. You can't symbolically represent everything that's relevant about a situation. You can't extract all of the meaning from a situation by just coming up with a list of things. There has to be some kind of connection between the like the structural functional organization, like what the features are, how they interact with the environment, and kind of create this gestalt whole of it all. And I think I loved it when he brought up the spotlight metaphor, because Chris Moll is actually my thesis supervisor, so I think it's hilarious that he brought that up. And I think that's what Chris Moll is saying too, is that like attention isn't this symbolic thing that just like happens. It's actually it's a process that's directly tied between an agent and an environment. And whenever you're trying to make meaning, whenever you're trying to pay attention, it's not this idea, this abstraction. It's actually a process, you interacting with the environment, and through that you can make meaning.
Yeah, and how it's a process of processes as well. Like it's a way of balancing and optimizing and making all these different processes work with each other. You know, like we have the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, we have like our physical sensations, our memories, all these different aspects of our cognition that are working together in attention or awareness or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
I think that it's there's a notion here as well. I love that as well. But coming back and saying it's more than just a feature list, right? That doesn't quite capture it. But it's also the thought occurred to me that, you know, just in contemplating, okay, having mode allows us to be more manipulatable, right? Is in some ways kind of falling into that same trap a little bit. In some way, I'm curious. I mean, the thought occurs to me, is having mode necessary at the beginning in order to really get to being mode? And I think that it is. I think there's an iteration of, okay, I have some having mode, some sense of that, until I find that the having mode actually doesn't, I'm starved for something deeper. And then I almost have to let go of that.
It seems like it would map onto spiral dynamics, like the orange and green transition. Wouldn't you say? Like orange would be more about having, green would be more about being? Maybe?
I would say they probably oscillate between, we probably oscillate between the two. And the problem is when we get stuck in the having mode, because there are certain things that we do need to have. And actually, rather than thinking about, yeah, I would say Maslow, exactly. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the lower needs are more about having, and the higher needs are about being. So like food, we need to eat. But also there's a meta need to be healthy. And same thing with like security, safety. We need to have a roof over our heads. We need to have, you know, in our current paradigm, money or some sort of, you know, resources. But also we need, on a meta level, we need for those things to be meaningful and contributing to society and blah, 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 blah. So it's like, yeah, there's two different sides to each thing that we need. So we have to oscillate between them, I think. Because I'm thinking also about babies, you know? Babies are in the being mode a lot of the time. They're just present and wide-eyed and everything is new and amazing, but they also have needs. They need to eat, they need to poop, they need to sleep, you know? So.
I feel like too, if you look at like hunter-gatherers, you get a much, much better relationship between having and being, where having is supporting being. And it's absolutely part of the equation, but there's a balance and it's not, there's no modal confusion. And then civilization comes along and suddenly everyone can have, and we have homes and walls and possessions, and then we become very confused very quickly, and then we end up where we are now, where we're completely cut off into the having mode. Many of us, for most of our lives, barely even aware there is another mode, and that any of that balance is completely gone out the window.
Yeah, I kind of fits a little bit with something I'm curious about, or I've been reading about my brain, and about all the different parts and what they do, and the ancient parts and the newer parts. And I'm wondering if that, how that fits with this, because your brain has a thinking part and an evolved part, and it has an ancient part, which is I was sort of more like a being, I guess, being part. And I'm wondering if that fits at all, or is it just that I'm reading about it?
To the brain part, there is a study that when we meditate, our brain activity most of the time in the frontal cortex is minimized, and we go back to a feeling of more stem or root brain, so the more primal brain part. We go back more there into it and into our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
I've been
sorry. I'm reading about, I'm trying to change old patterns. I'm trying to replace them. And so reading and being interested in kind of going back there so I can understand it and then sort of start forward again. And this discussion sort of touches that. It seems like connected.
Mm-hmm.
I've been poking around Michael Anderson's book, Beyond Phrenology, which is what John Vervaeke's essential, like he draws a lot of his perspective on how the brain works, which is Michael Anderson's work basically points to exaptation, the idea that our brain, what the work sort of implies is, or describes, is that our brain basically creates little machines in it, and then those machines sort of build bigger machines, and they sort of change and adapt as relevant things change. And this, as opposed to a modular view of the brain, which is like your front part does this, and your insula does this, and it's been interesting poking around in that. It's a little bit dense. The book, once again, is called Beyond Phrenology, but it's also fairly readable. And so if that's something you're interested in, I'd recommend that book.
Yeah, I'd say there is something really fascinating about that, and I think this is kind of pointing to what my motivation was in bringing it up. Is there is much more of a feedback mechanism, much more of an agent arena type development that's happening. At the same time that the having mode seems to be extremely active in our species. I'm kind of keeping an eye on the YouTube chat as well, and somebody mentioned rat utopia just in the comment, and it's like, yeah, there's something very interesting that what we seem to be doing with our comfort level, our housing and everything, making us comfortable, is creating a human utopia, but not really. It's really a human dystopia that is as comfortable as possible. Like we're maximizing the distractions and really ignoring the deeper needs that we have. Getting them, fine-tuning them really, and it's tempting. This is what I'm saying about the temptation to think that there is a they who is manipulating us, and the thought that, when we actually really recognize the fullness of the agent arena dynamic of that, then there's something, and it is like more finely tuning the machines that we develop. If we can use Facebook in a way that actually accomplishes a more being mode interaction, then and find ways to do that, then I think that Facebook or other systems will allow us to actually move more in that direction. So in a way, it's like we can't move away from it as long as we're continually pressing on that lever, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And this is why developing sovereignty makes you less manipulable, where that stuff just stops being salient, and it stops having such an effect on you, where you're no longer pulled by it in the same way, and you can participate in a completely different way.
I think one of the bigger problems with social media from a functional perspective is the externalization of relevance realization using algorithms that give you more of what you're already clicking on. So you've got your own relevance realization, you click on something, and then YouTube gives you its own version of your relevance realization system and feeds you more. I think when we transitioned from just that date organized news feed to what Facebook and YouTube deems relative, that was a big jump backwards in terms of our own personal development.
It's if you think about the agent and the arena is mutating so fast that it's difficult for the agent to keep up.
Well, it's like the arena is trying to do the job of the agent in at least with these tools.
And you know, what just struck me too is that the arena, social media, completely conflates salience and relevance, right? So relevance means how many likes it got. And really that has nothing to do with something's relevance. But it's equivalent as far as the algorithm's concerned, because that's all it can understand.
Even the word that we use, you know, that this is culturally relevant or not culturally relevant. It means like how loudly people are talking about it.
Well, I think this is one of the big points that Vervaeke is trying to make, like with the algorithmic kind of search that we have going on, is that computers can only deal with symbolic representations. They have no idea what is actually going on. And like, I always love Nick Bostrom's book, like Superintelligence, where he talks about, you know, the paperclip maximizer that just keeps making paperclips forever. And it's not that it intentionally kills all humans, it just kills everybody because it's maximizing this other metric of paperclips, and it just doesn't even realize that there are other features to this problem, such as, you know, human well-being. And so when you have something like Facebook or YouTube that's trying to maximize watch time, it's that same thing Vervaeke is talking about, where it's like it's coming up with a single feature that it's trying to maximize instead of being embedded in the system and trying to optimize for all parts of the problem. It's like you've blinded yourself. You've put on these blinders and have just like started looking at one single thing and endlessly pursuing that, and you're not even aware of the costs in all of the other areas.
Yeah. I just thought of that comment about the rat paradise and how our world is optimized to be extra cushy and comfortable and immediately provide for all of our needs at the slightest like click. You click on something and then Google is like, oh, you want that, here's more of that. How it's, in a way, it's kind of a luxury virtual reality prison.
Yeah, you know, and it's also interesting to think that it's actually getting better, right? I was thinking about originally Amazon. You know, you buy a doll for your niece, and all of a sudden you get a lot of dolls. It's like, oh, I only cared about that one time, but it does. And I don't know about Amazon so much, but someone else mentioned, you know, there's something about YouTube is actually and bringing us together, right? The algorithms are doing something for that, but I do wonder. There is a Eric, I'm curious if you've read Stuart Russell's latest book, the Human Compatible. He's also an AI researcher who's it does a much better job at actually looking at the depth of what the challenges of AI are. And I think that it really gets to an interesting point of it's not the reward function can't be within the domain of the algorithm that's deciding whether, you know, if you have a point system that the algorithm can manipulate directly, then it actually gets into a feedback loop that can hyper attune it to one specific thing. And it has to be kind of constantly, in a way, I've thought this for a while, that I don't know if I want this or not. I want this, I may want this, my computer to know when I'm dissatisfied, when I'm frustrated, when it's actually doing something that I don't want it to do. And it's a good question of, you know, do I want it to be monitoring that? Do I want to be more aware of when, you know, and I think that surprising thing is, I think the algorithms can actually, you know, my camera, my sensors, and even just the pace of my typing can be used by my device to determine my frustration level before I'm aware of it. And so we really have an interesting opportunity, and I'm sure that the companies are thinking about this, of ways of using that data to more finely tune the relevance realization. But I do think there's something of a kind of a holographic relevance realization where it really is like, wait a minute, what is salient? Are we part of the relevance right now is how much are we being manipulated? That's one of the things that would be an interesting thing to notice and have it as part of the meta feedback loop of being able to tell. But it's a real challenge to figure out how to do that in a meaningful way.
I feel like that could also turn into like a kind of a pleasure feeding cycle.
Exactly,
where
yeah.
you know, not everything that is relevant or important to us is comfortable. And that's something that's I think been really exacerbated with social media, that with these kind of algorithms feeding people what they're already doing, we're not actually getting what is good for us but painful.
Yeah, because frustration also leads to growth. It leads us to seek other solutions, to seek other opinions. Like cognitive dissonance is what causes us to grow psychologically. So if everything is comfortable, that's just more padding for the luxury prison.
Right, and
my
actually,
question, I was going to ask whether, if we're conscious of those algorithms, if we get to manipulate them, whether that makes it better or worse. If we can choose how much discomfort we're comfortable with, so that we're not getting the discomfort of, like horrible images we can't have anything to deal with, but we can choose, you know what, I do care about this piece and I'm willing to be uncomfortable with it. Because I find if I'm too uncomfortable, I can't grow at all. There's too much flying at me, there's too much sensory stuff, and it just shuts down my nervous system. Whereas if I'm safe, if my needs are met and I have enough having, then I can concentrate on the being, and I get to choose that, right? I find for me it's more powerful when I get to choose it.
I think this is a funny thing to think about, because it asking whether people can know their own comfort level, what they'll be able to deal with, is also an isolating thing from reality, which is, I think, what we're trying to figure out is like, how do we have this be an appropriate proxy for reality so that we're not weakened to exposure by exposure and instead are able to adapt. So, for example, if we were to choose our own comfort level with these algorithms, we're obviously going to choose it more. We're going to choose the more comfortable option in almost every case. People are programmed to be doing that. Reality is the force, or like the world, or mate selection, like so many different factors that are actually against what we choose to do, but are actually forcing our evolution because we don't get a choice with it. And I'm not saying like that it should be some external person who decides. What I think I'm proposing is that these relevance realization algorithms should really be dumbed down and be optimized for truth instead of what is emotionally relevant
Or convenient.
So I want to say there is a Royal Institute talk recently that there is no algorithm for truth. That's actually the name of it, and he talks about the fact that it doesn't matter what you do in terms of trying to figure out what the criteria is for some algorithm to monitor. It will figure out a way to hijack that whatever algorithm, whatever signal that you use to determine, is this actually doing what I want it to get you to do something what it wants you to do, or something more subtle. But I do think so. Here's a thought about this. There's something in the collective nature of this. One of the things I think about is, what are the unintended consequences that choosing my comfort level has? If I think that I'm properly mitigating my addiction level, do I think that a week into use, a month into use, do I think that still when I witness what Mike and Yuvi are doing with theirs, like, oh, wait a minute, I seem to be really hyper focused on this one thing to the distraction of something else that I thought I cared about. If I'm sort of tracking that over time and through a different layer of reflection, I may be able to bring more awareness to, oh, this is a way in which my having mode addictions are not visible to me. I don't know if that's possible to actually bring that into to have that be part of some kind of
I love that
mediated.
idea.
Yeah.
That's a cool idea. To be able to see what each other is paying attention to at some level. Maybe there'd be some of it that you wouldn't want to be public, but I mean, if you know the level of filtering that other people are doing, at least some proxy of it, that would be interesting. But as well, I like what Reddit does with its newsfeed filtering, where you can choose most popular, most recent, most controversial. That's another one I really like. So you can kind of set the algorithm the way you want, and we just don't get that option in other platforms.
I agree, and there's something about this though that I think is really important to consider, is that proxies for relevance, like most recent, most liked, unseen, are still problematic, and that my own relevance is unique to me.
Yeah.
It may be influenced by, and I really have thought about this in terms of the way that neurons work in a brain, that each neuron has its own function of what it cares about, paying attention to the 10,000 synapses that it's listening to. And when some threshold event occurs by that complex algorithm, it tips over, and that signal is repropagated to another one of the 10,000 synapses that another neuron is listening to. So I don't want to aggregate too much of that any place from any chief neuron saying, this is signal. I don't want anything else to interfere with my ability to say, this is signal. I want to know what all the people in my network think is signal, but at a level of, right now, what am I interested in? What am I focused on? Not, it's interesting. Like, I am curious. I've thought about this, and I don't know all of the challenges with getting away from the addictive loop of it. But it's possible. I mean, already that iPhone tells me what my weekly social media time is. So there's something that, I think over time we could be able to look at this reflectively, look at it and say, oh, it seems like you're really going heavy towards the addiction cycle. You're really going for quick payoff on things. And again, it's not from a perspective of that relevance realization, just as Vervaeke says, is really difficult to name. I mean, that's the whole series is effectively saying this is an important aspect, and it's not anything that you can write down or write an algorithm for. It is always a present moment being mode way of experiencing the world.
Yes, I have sensory processing disorder. So when sensory stuff is coming at me, I can't function and my nervous system shuts down. And I think we all have it to a certain degree where we can, that's why they torture people with sound and light, that you have a certain, and I have to figure out my.
Oh, we lost camera and audio feed.
You're muted.
All right. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Didn't like what I was saying. That's having that I have to figure out the limit of what I can be capable of. Because if I cut out all sound and I just stay in quiet, my threshold goes down, and then I'm more triggered by stuff. If I overdo it, everything is coming at me, and I can't handle anything in life. And I guess what I mean by choosing your own algorithm, I had a friend one Mother's Day kind of comment that she just didn't want to see Mother's Day posts on Mother's Day because she has a really toxic relationship with her mother. And everyone else was like, well, that's ridiculous. You can't have people not commenting on Mother's Day. And I was like, well, what if there was an option, though, for her not to see it, right? For her to check off a box to be like, she understands Mother's Day is going on. She's not cutting that off completely, but cutting off things that highly trigger you so you can concentrate on your signal in the noise, right? And if there's enough of us doing that, like we all can't concentrate on all of the atrocities and all of the meaning that's going on at the same time, but to focus it in and find your piece of it and find the piece that you're comfortable being uncomfortable with so that you can block out the rest, I think it could have catastrophic other effects, but I think that there's a benefit to it.
I think it takes a high degree of self-awareness to be able to know that discomfort is even a necessary thing to growth. especially to your own, like what is relevant to you and that you would need to grow in. I think if people have those tools, which they do to a high degree already, we're just going to increase our fragility.
Yeah, it's that padding for the luxury prison again.
And I guess, though, as somebody who has a high degree of like that threshold, right, where
Yeah.
things that are totally normal for everyone else are really toxic for me and I need to be able to dim it down. I've dimmed down my whole life, right?
Yeah.
I've dimmed down, like, I need to have nearly zero stress to be in my house most of the time. And I do have a high degree of self-awareness, so it's hard to speak from a different point. But from that, I'm then able to grow way better because I have that. I'm not in a war zone, right? I'm not in, so that therefore I can be like, okay, when something happens that is uncomfortable, I have much more space and freedom to learn from that and grow. Like last week where I was like, that didn't feel good, that conversation where I was yelling at people, right? That wouldn't, if I had those conversations constantly all the time, I wouldn't have been able to learn from it and grow. And that, like, there's something there of being able to say, okay, you don't get to decide what my comfort level is, right? Because you're not going to be able to. You're not going to know that the sound, the sight, the smells that I can handle. Only I can know that. And to be able to give me a space of my own utopia, I'm better able to handle the stress to be able to grow. And it's a very individual thing.
I have to jump in here.
Yeah.
I have to jump in here because I have the same experience as Jubilee to a large extent of a background of sensitivity disorders with all kinds of things that I can't handle, and many years spent on my couch in my house because of that. And I know exactly what she's talking about having to stop many, many things from entering my orbit or I'll be overwhelmed. And I'm trying to think of how did I do that? Because I navigated that successfully somehow to the extent that I'm now starting to come out the other side of it and having the reduced reactivity that John Vervaeke was talking about. And I think it comes down to, if you don't have tools like that, if you can't press a button and stop the input from coming in, then you have to develop a really, really highly attuned discernment towards what is okay and what is not, and navigate that line like a tightrope for yourself. And it builds a skill around what I guess around relevance realization in a way. It builds a skill around like what do I need to know, and what is okay to allow into my awareness, that it's not going to overwhelm me, and that over time then those things begin to grow. But I think tools like that, while they seem helpful because they would have served that purpose and done that for me, then it is simply a crutch that then I don't have to develop that discernment for myself.
I guess that's my
thinking.
Question. Sorry, Heather.
Yeah.
Would you be able to do that with everything coming at you, right? Like, because you have to be able to dim it a bit. At least I did, because now that I'm in that, now that I've made my life easy, I can now find myself digging myself out to be like, okay, now I can handle a day out, right? Now I can handle much more. And so I'm able to go back into the world and contribute in a way I wasn't able to when there was all this stuff constantly coming at me. But I had to kind of set that. And then it's finding the balance of not cutting it out completely to lower that, just to lower it constantly.
Yeah. So you're right. In a sense, like there's something here that I think is really key, because I did have to cut off media completely. So like I consumed basically no news for a number of years. And that's not, I was going to say that's not a great idea, but in some sense it is a great idea. So I don't even know, like, I feel like any consumption of news at this point is so impossibly skewed and confusing that if you consume news, then you think you know what's going on, which you completely don't. So in some ways it's better to not consume news, because then at least you know don't know what's going on. So I don't know, it's a complicated issue. I'm not sure.
I want to bring it back actually to the first lecture that John Vervaeke in the series, where he talks about psychotechnologies of shamans. And they used both internal and external psychotechnologies or technologies. So, depriving themselves of social contact or of stimulation or of food or of sex or of sleep or of any number of things Like, that's an external measure, and that's the same thing that you guys are describing. So I think that both internal and external tools are viable for this. Yeah.
You know, this brings this the two of you, Jubilee and Heather. Boy, props, first of all. It must be difficult in this world to have that kind of an issue. But I'm lifetime, I'm an alcoholic. I've spent a lot of time depressed, and I've had all these I bring this baggage with me. And I know that if I'm in a good place, and if I'm in balance, then this discussion makes sense, and I can sort of get into the nuances and say yes a little bit more, a little bit less. But if I'm not, if I'm in a place of addiction or of depression, forget it. I mean, I'm not going to be capable of making those kinds of decisions for myself and certainly don't want to leave them to an algorithm. So what do I do?
Which brings the whole thing back to having and being mode, right? Because I think you're talking about being mode is that algorithms and consuming things they deliver us, all of that comes back to having mode at the end of the day, right? It's like what instead of how. Whereas how we are in our being when we approach those things, when we interact with algorithms, when we watch YouTube videos, that's what actually matters for hitting all those key points in relevance realization and making sure we're not sucked into those algorithms. That it's approaching all of the stuff we're talking about through the being mode somehow, which is incredibly difficult when we're entrained through our entire life to live in having mode, and marketers are trying to keep us in confusion so that we buy their stuff.
There was a really good point that Chris Beasley brought up in one of our private group calls, where she talked about personal boundaries being like a membrane rather than a wall, where it's permeable, and the membrane decides what comes in and what comes out, and kind of it does it on a moment-to-moment basis. So the membrane has some sort of relevance realization where it decides on those things, and kind of fine-tuning that process is what we're talking about here, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris and I have talked about that many times, and this is also back to the notion of the middle way, being perfectly tuned. It really is agent arena attunement, inside and outside, being in a dance with each other, and looking at that. And there is something that I think is the notion that we have where we can get so far into the having mode that we're far, just as you were saying, John, you can go so far into that moment where you've given up your sovereignty, your agency to be able to make the decision to stop, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. And oh, at the point that it would occur to me to stop doing this because I don't think it's healthy, I'm already, the rat's already in the lever pressing mode. It's not going to listen anymore. But there is something that I've noticed for myself, which is kind of a proto shaman training type thing, to notice that moment when I seem to be attached. And this is kind of back to the beginning of this lecture when John was talking about disillusionment as painful, right? In that moment, when I first noticed the first pinch of disillusionment, it has me pop out of, it has me sort of come into lucid illusionment, right? Like, oh, wait a minute, something's happening here. I notice that I'm attached to something that I don't really think is appropriate for me to be attached to. I notice that I'm about to slide down a slippery slope where I'm going to lose my choicefulness if I keep going. And it's the kind of a subtle thing that I know I've trained myself for. And I think that Heather and Jubilee is the kind of thing that you're pointing out as well. This notion of, okay, let me go below the threshold and come back up to it and notice, oh, when I tip over, okay, now back off, come back up to it, and okay, I've tipped over. And there's something in the training that does train the awakening of the being mode across multiple domains. That is an interesting way that I am curious, again, not have technology solve it for me, but to have technology help train me in that. And gameplay is an interesting one of these notions of the flow state, where we get into that, and then it's okay, have I like, it would be interesting to have a game that says, human, don't let me addict you, don't let me put you in a rat prison, let's go. If you can avoid it.
Whoa.
Isn't that life in a way?
That's a
I had a
fantastic
question.
game idea.
Wanted to know whether there's been a rat experiment. There's been the old one of we're all addicted, and and then they gave them rat heaven, and they had the control and the rat heaven, and they didn't get addicted. But have they taken rats, gotten them addicted in the old one, and then put them in the ratopia and seen, once they're addicted, do they choose their addiction or do they choose life? And how do you get them to that? Because that's what we're in. That's our actual life right now, is we're addicted. How do we get us to ratopia so we're connected and being instead of having?
I think I'm not positive. I'd have to go look, but I do believe that they've done experiments like that. And I know that some of the studies, at least, like Vietnam veterans who were addicted to heroin and came back to the United States, once they returned home, they just dropped their addictions. Many of them did, without any counseling or anything. So they sort of had an established habit. Now I'm curious if they have to have experienced a true healthy environment before becoming addicted in order to be able to recognize a healthy environment, or so it would be very interesting to see. I think there's something really important about that question. And also the way, that question makes me think the way that we do science and the way that we ask these questions, I think is needs to be really investigated. I think a lot of times the way that we do research is flawed. A book, I'm going to recommendation. Robert Sapolsky wrote a book called Behave, which is a fairly big book, but if you're interested in these kinds of things, it's a really good book on looking at the way that most of the studies that we have skew our thinking about things in a way that's like, it doesn't actually have us thinking about the true relevance of something. It has us focus on one, it's like, is nature, is life more nature or nurture based? It's like trying to decide one or the other misses the interrelationship between the two. And science often tries to decide by cutting down to a reductionist truth. And it's like, it's more complex than that. You're never going to actually get to it with a reductionist approach. And so I think that, little side note on something to think about in the way that our institutions do research, that goes into this thought a little bit as well.
Yeah, something John Greenhall talked a lot about, especially about what we were talking right now, in his, I think, 2.5 minutes long video on Rebel Wisdom. A lot about the game theory, a lot about those environmental aspects, or seeing those environmental aspects. So maybe watch there again may help understand more, integrate more.
I feel like there's something to David, in what you're saying that goes back to when John Vervaeke said, when you negate something, you're still looking at it in the same frame. Mm-hmm. Does that, yeah.
Yeah, it's that point of trying to say like, oh, social media gets us addicted, therefore it's bad, we should just cut out social media. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I think there is a point here. I mean, and I think it is an exploration. I think that the notion is that really has to be an individual exploration, and it's kind of my point before. To go back to the notion that I think we start off with having mode, bankrupt that, and then discover a new being mode. So I say that like, and there's some sense in me that I intuitively think that that's true, but the application of that, we mentioned Maslow's hierarchy and spiral dynamics, different developmental models. Typically, one of the challenges that people who first get introduced to those models have is recognizing that it's a feedback loop up and down. It's not just a sequential, oh yeah, I have my physical needs. Okay, now I'm going to my, it's not a climb up the ladder and then I just go higher and higher and higher. It is a complex feedback loop of might, and each person goes through it a little bit differently, although there are a lot of similarities between the way that humans go through that. And you can almost see, this is again my favorite movie, Inside Out, where we have periodic phase shifts, right? Where we're going, and it's okay. Here's a point where it's teenagehood, when your hormones start changing and you grow into an adult phasing mode, your mental model also reboots. And so there's what previously was a pretty established mode of being no longer makes any sense. So there's kind of a meta having mode that falls away, and a new being mode that is terrifying at first. So I think that this cycle of going back and forth up the cycle is something that happens, and so there's something in the complexity of that, Heather, that I'm thinking about, not so much in a full-on throw this away and go in this direction, but that feeling moment to moment. Can I tell right now, am I in a being mode, or am I illusion? Am I in the illusion of a being mode?
My mind falls right now Kant and his philosophy of Maxime, which is like a principle you're ordering yourself through, like the red thread in and that is, in my mind, something that is a lot of describing a lot of the things that we are talking about, like having a moral is like having laws, but we also have the internal moral that we don't want to hurt somebody else, and we don't need the law for that, right? There is like this red thread through us that is who we are, like our being. So I think it's also this always concentrating and falling back on yourself and feeling yourself and recognizing who you really are, like not the little things that maybe get sometimes a little bit scrappy, but the overall shape, the overall being. So that's also what I try in meditation, like just focusing on myself, just on this still point. So yeah.
It reminds me of something. Earlier in this conversation, we were talking about that it's not so much about the thing we're interacting with, it's about how we're interacting with it. So there's that expression, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. It's like the activity remains the same, it's just your relationship with it changes. So yeah, when people try to kind of compartmentalize things, like, oh, this activity is healthy, or this activity is spiritual, this thing is not spiritual, like it's not about that, obviously. It's about the participatory experience with the activity.
Which I think comes back to why this mindfulness term seems so misunderstood in the West, because we are understanding it through having mode, and it can't actually be understood that way, because what we're understanding as mindfulness it's like the shadow version of what mindfulness is, in a way. I think it's this weird thing that we're trying to shoehorn into our lives so that we can be more productive and make more money and all of this stuff.
Yeah, and spirituality, in some experiences I had, made most of the people like living on a more root basis, like reducing their life cost or focusing on a project they really like. So yeah.
I wanted to jump back to what Jubilee and Heather was saying, and I noticed that Jubilee just left, but there was something about this aspect of reducing the noise to increase relevance realization or signal, or to use the sovereignty framework, it would be to increase your ability to perceive, perceive and have agency so that you can actually do something about it. But then there's this huge problem that I'm trying to figure out and how it relates to you two and Heather, specifically what you've done, which is the sense making thing. Like, how do you choose what is relevant, especially when that thing is also really, really uncomfortable? And there's this, that's one thing, like exposure to the world or to aspects of reality that are painful increases your resilience and anti-fragility. But there's even coming to that conclusion, which is a really difficult thing. So it's like, I agree with the noise reduction part to the degree that it's not simply an avoidance of those other things that would actually increase your resilience. Like, as long as you can have it increases your agency and sense making to be able to choose the next steps. But that's what I think is not happening most of the time. I think what is happening most of the time is like a comfort optimization thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I study a martial art that is called schema. It's from Russia. And there is everything about this meditative focus, or at least in my training now it became exactly what you're talking about, like trying to create a physical and mental structure that provides the aspects you talked about, like being resilient, but sensing everything, sensing the intention of somebody, sensing their physical structure to the minutest muscle. Like those things, that is really interesting. And not to a conclusion yet, I didn't came to a conclusion yet about how and what everything of this works, but it's really interesting to experience that in a really intense way, like having a conflict situation, or acting with the anxiety that comes up when somebody just maybe threatens you, maybe just even walk at you. Like some people get so anxious when somebody is just walking into their personal sphere, which is normal, of course, but just feeling that, sensing that may even give you such a control, or not control, but a sense of how you can regulate in those situations and still be resilient, but still be functional and resilient.
Yeah, there's actually, I think we talked about this in one of the earlier discussions, where you can retrain your mind. It's that point about exaptation again. We can retrain our mind to treat pain or discomfort as simply information, as signal. As Ken Wilber actually talks about this, and in his words, he says, as you become more awake, you become more sensitive to pain, so it hurts more, but it bothers you less.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I think there's something about this which is about metabolizing pain such that it's not suffering, right?
Yeah.
Metabolizing sensation so that that awareness stays present, and I think that's a big part of sovereignty, right?
Yeah. It was a big part of it was the process that we use to metabolize, which is negated or even undermined completely by giving people the controls to control their own comfort and filtering prematurely before they've gained that wisdom, which is why I think we have such a challenged society and a triggered society. It's like we've been raised and our parents haven't even provided that wisdom. They've almost exacerbated the problem by exposing us less or sheltering us. And then we've been given the controls so early on to be able to reduce that external exposure. And now, now it's just become this point where we can't exist out there in the world. Everything is such high sensory input, and we have so little ability to metabolize, like you said, that pain. And so what I do think is like we need to take baby steps in the direction of like bringing back that exposure, and we can't just jump back into the real world from that level, because we have so little or so thin skin to be able to deal with those things. But I don't know if I'm stuck on this idea of the controls thing, because it's one of the most it's one of the biggest problems we're facing in modern times right now. And we're gaining more and more controls all the time. And we're also demanding that external agents do things with those controls, shelter us even more, make laws to shelter us even more. And it's like, it's an alarming thing, which is why I feel like, to me, it's so salient, why I want to talk about it so much.
Yeah, I agree.
think,
I was just going to say, I wonder if this is the interest in the rising interest in Stoicism.
I think, yeah, I think it relates.
Yeah, it moves in the direction of, so there is an awareness out there. It's not broad spectrum right now. There's still, I think most people believe that they're able to silence the suffering, right? There's still some illusion that they still have a belief the having mode is going to get them there.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, like, it's interesting because my situation is a microcosm of sort of societies and maybe a more extreme version of it. So I think it can give some insight. But yeah. I think, because I very much lived through a lot of comfort optimization, like really, that's all I could do for a long time. And then I think what happens is that eventually that becomes the gilded prison. And and I think everyone does know, and that's why it's such a problem. Like, we're not in a comfortable palace. We're in a palace surrounded by sick, old, dead people. Like, we know outside those palace walls, there's bad stuff going on. So it's not fun to be in here, no matter how much we optimize our comfort. Part of us knows it's not comfortable out there. And so once I realized, I guess once I had this sense that I was in this prison, not in a conscious way, but in a felt sense, then I think that's what activates what John Vervaeke talks about as these meta drives for self-development and attunement to reality. And then once those drives are activated, something happens with relevance realization that goes into the world and pulls in what you need to satisfy those drives. And as soon as those loops are activated, I think then that's what gets people out of the initial comfort phase.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's not, but I don't know that it's something that can be triggered for people. I'm not sure how it, like, everything in my own experience arose when it did, because it needed to at that point, without any effort on my part or anyone else's. It just sort of did, and there was a lot of long years of suffering in the meantime.
It's amazing how much of this is just related to a really bad parenting experiment that we've all gone through. That so much of this to me just seems about, like, give children in their early years exposure rather than shelter. And I don't mean, that's a little too black and white, but you know what I mean to say, expose them more than we have been in the last several decades. It just seems like so much is mitigated. So much of our suffering in modern life is mitigated by a little more exposure in the early years.
There's also another side to it, because I understand why you're saying that, but it's both and. So on one hand, we have certain things, we could say having mode things that actually make us more resilient to pursue the being mode. So, for example, a child that is breastfed for 2 years develops a much better immune system than a child that goes on formula right away and does not get all those antibodies from the mother. So, like, if we expose children too early to those artificial nutrients, environmental toxins, whatever, they actually never develop the capacity to deal with it.
Right.
So it's about developing that capacity. So this is where that point that Heather and Jubilee are bringing up, like, we need to get to a degree of safety so that we can develop the capacity to go out there and explore. And it's the same thing for children.
I just think that just like children, most of the time we can't tell what our own capacities are, and we're not going to force it. Like, that's the wisdom we're trying to build in order to be selective and conscious about how we're going to grow. We want that knowledge that, first of all, exposure is even relevant and important. And then, okay, what kind of exposure should I get? So it's in no place of the child to be making that decision for itself of what exposure it should get. You know, if I'm not saying like go out there and like just let it do what it wants, because the child will go and expose itself. But what I'm saying is giving it the tools to cut off its exposure is like, that's a bad idea.
I want to jump in here because I think that's really important. There's an important thing to note, and there's something about it that I think is important. You know, just in this lecture as well, the fact that Buddha was, you know, in the mythology of it anyway, was kept in the palace, away from all of the having mode stuff, you know, purely in the having mode, away from the being mode, and then goes out into the world and sees it. You know, Heather, your point that wait a minute, it's dangerous out there, let me run away. But the insight was he had enough, just in my thought, he had enough awareness to realize running back to the palace isn't going to solve the problem, right? And the way, Mike, this is kind of what you're saying, you know, so running away from the palace, back to the palace is like, no, old age is going to chase me, sickness is going to chase me. I have to actually face this, you know, this thing that I've been ignoring. I need to actually look in the eye. I need to go to the suffering, even though I wouldn't think that I would want to choose that. Not choosing it isn't an escape. That's fallacy. That's a fallacy to think that. But there's also something that I think is important, because it's not just a flawed thing in parenting. I want to make that note that we have such a strong push societally towards a having mode indoctrination, right? We, in a way, we override children's being mode very early. Have mode. And, you know, someone in the Facebook, in the YouTube channel was saying, you know, it's hard to have these conversations without talking about trauma. And I think we're doing institutionalized micro trauma on everybody because we're overriding being mode at such an early age. And this is the consequence of that. After a period of time, it's like, yeah, you're not going to be able to, you know, okay, you can do this as long as you want to, which may mean climate collapse or civilization collapse or something else. You know, you're going to get to that point where eventually the being mode's going to interject and say, sorry guys, your bill's due.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually the point about breastfeeding is that it builds up the child's capacity to go out and be in being mode. Whereas external interference constantly and external control and safety mechanisms, in the way that we think of them in the Western society, reinforce having mode.
That's in a way like the exploration models I studied in my movement science class, and about sociological aspects about movement. And there was like a curiosity which came from inside, which is intrinsic, and then there was the opposite to it was external. So you're motivated by your mother, you're motivated by something that is externally just giving you the task, but you don't really want to do it like perfectly.
I think we could probably wrap up here on that note, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a little
It's
late.
been really good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this has been awesome. This is the best one yet, I think. Cool.
It was really nice to have more people as well,
Yeah.
more different perspectives and questions adding to it. So hope to see you guys again next week.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cool.
See you soon.
Very good discussion. Thank you.
Cool. Bye, guys.
Bye.